Welcome back to the New Bridge Radio Show on WLTKDB Let's Talk. I am your host, Kevin Mackey, and we are connecting you to what's next in your life. And we're here to remind you that you are important to this world, and we sure are glad to have you along on this episode of the New Bridge Radio Show. If you are not familiar by now, you can see the New Bridge Radio Show live on our station website. All you need to do is just head on over to www.wltkdb.com. You'll be able to see the show live, and you'll also be able to enter our chat room and ask questions and make comments about the show. Also, remember, if you would like to get in touch with the New Bridge Radio Show, you can email us at thenewbridgeradioshow@gmail.com. We love hearing from you. Let us know what you like about the show, or let us know what you don't like about the show. And feel free to let us know if you would like to be a guest on the New Bridge Radio Show, because we love talking to people who have figured out what was next in their life. But tonight on the New Bridge Radio Show, we are very pleased to have Dr. Christopher Earnshaw as our special guest. Dr. Earnshaw holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Japanese and Chinese from London University. He also holds a PhD in neuroscience, is the CEO of a medical device company in Tokyo, Japan. Dr. Earnshaw is also an amateur cellist and a lecturer at the School of Social Sciences at Waseda University, Tokyo. He is a past Grand Historian and 33-degree Freemason, as well as the author of books on neuroscience, Japanese art, and is, interestingly enough, a licensed cook at through Le Cordon Bleu, the same culinary school I went to. I am most pleased to welcome him to the show. Welcome to the show, Dr. Earnshaw. How are you doing tonight?
I'm great, thank you very much. I'm well rested. It's 9 o'clock here in Tokyo.
I know you are actually talking to us from the future.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
We have just barely made it through Tuesday.
Hello to Wednesday.
Hello to Wednesday. I hope it's as good.
Yeah.
Well, I'm quite pleased that you reached out to our show, Dr. Earnshaw, because I have a number of family members that were members of the Masonic Lodge. And it wasn't, I didn't find out about it until, much later in life, after my my paternal grandmother had passed away. And we were back at her funeral, and everybody snuck away. And I'm like, "Where's everybody going?" And they're like, "Oh, we're going to the lodge funeral for your grandmother." And I'm like, "Oh, the lodge funeral." And that's sort of how I found out that a lot of the Mackeys here were part of the Masonic Lodge. So I thought it'd be interesting to have you as our guest. And as I've been learning more about the Masonic Lodge through your book, I've just been more and more curious. So, just to start out, tell us about the Masonic Lodge and this fraternal order, and how long you've been a part of it.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, I'm not actually an official spokesman for Freemasonry, but I'm definitely an enthusiast. So put that out first. I've been a Mason for 38 years, and a 33rd degree Mason for 3 years. His Masonry, we in Masonry, we call it a peculiar system of morality. And I don't think it's actually peculiar because it's based on Christianity, but we are also an international charity, and we have about 6 million members worldwide in 80 countries, and we give about $4 million every day to charity. So we are one of the world's major charities, though it's not well recognized. So the lodge performs a play, and the play is in 3 parts. We call them the 3 degrees, and each part teaches a form of morality, a way to live a life as a decent, God-fearing person.
So, you mentioned the degrees in your first book, Initiation by Light,
Yeah.
and I had a lot of questions about it because I know there are some parts you probably can't can't tell us everything about,
Yes.
but
Right.
can you give us an idea, having gone through through the three degrees, how did they change you as you went through each one of them?
So we feel that firstly, Freemasonry isn't based on any one religion. It isn't even Christian, but we do have a Christian Bible on in the center of the lodge. And we ask people who join Freemasonry to make a pledge uh, to God that they will be, from this point onward, not just God-fearing, but also moral people, and will work to improve society, as well as improving themselves, at the same time improve society. Um, and if the person joining is a Muslim, we'll ask him to bring the Quran, and then he can put an oath on the Quran. And Chinese, they use the Taoist Tao Te Ching. So we are not a religious organization. But we do believe that God is paramount in our lives. So we had, as you mentioned, have 3 degrees. So we feel that the person coming into a lodge is in a state of darkness, and our job is to transfer light to them, transfer wisdom to them, and um, it's a kind of opening into a spiritual journey. And then the 2nd degree is kind of symbolic of how a person is transferred from a man into a gentleman, or into uh, make learning through trial and error how he can improve himself in life. And then the 3rd degree talks about death and rebirth, and the he's brought into a new way of thinking, and he's joined this new brotherhood, and he's become a part of a community. So it's
Hmm.
a kind of 3-step process.
Hmm. So, is it kind of like is it kind of like do you go through? Well, I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but do you kind of go through something of a spiritual attunement?
Yes, so that's our intention.
Hmm.
I think over the years, and that's why I wrote my books, as you mentioned, The Initiation by Light, um, that initially the and my premise is that actually Freemasonry is based on a Chinese practice, because at the time in England, Chinese things were very, very popular. That included, and we're talking about the 1700s, early 1700s, late 1600s, and trade with China was just starting through the British East India Company. People started to drink tea in England. Before that, they would drink beer all the time. There was nothing but beer, and so they didn't get drunk all the time. They put water. They reduced it with water to make it weak beer, so you could drink it for breakfast, lunch, and supper. But in the late 1600s, we introduced tea. This was followed by silk, and also you need cups to drink the tea in. We only had earthenware jugs, so we brought in this beautiful pottery, which was specially made by adding handles so you could hold it. The Chinese don't have handles on their cups; they
Mhm.
hold it differently. And then following that came silk, and furniture, and then house designs. So we have many houses in England that have Chinese features built in, because it was a rage at the time. And so I believe that Freemasonry also incorporated a lot of Chinese things, but they were hidden
Mhm.
inside the ritual. And this Chinese, what it was about was, it's based on Taoism. And Taoism is interesting for 2 reasons. Firstly, again, it's not a religion, it's a way of life, it's a philosophy. And
Yeah.
secondly, Taoism is about introducing light to the candidate. And so among the world's organizations, including religions, people normally are initiated with either water or fire. We only Taoism and Freemasonry initiate with light, and that makes us unique.
Hmm. So, one thing you talk about is you found a similarity between uh, Taoism and Freemasonry and the study of light, and you talk about it in your book as well. Um,
Yes,
you also became initiated in a Taoist way, didn't you?
yes, yes. So this is in 2016. So at universities, you mentioned I studied Chinese and Japanese, which was a bit of a mistake, really, because I was very young and I saw the future of economics. This is when I went to school in the 70s.
Hmm.
Um, I saw the future of economics being in the Far East. And so I thought I'd better have the two major languages, but the problem is that Chinese and Japanese, though they both use Chinese characters, what we call kanji, um, the kanji are different in each country, and so I found myself just flooded with so much information. It's like doing 2 degrees at the same time rather than just 1 degree. It was a bit of a mistake, but I struggled through and I got a pass. So and
Right.
uh, so yes, so I forgot the question. Sorry.
Uh-huh.
Oh yes, so I was so because of my interest in so at university they taught us not just the language but also Chinese philosophy. So I studied Lao Tzu, Confucius, and Mencius, and I found Mencius to be the most accessible to China, easy to understand, because he uses a lot of illustrative stories in his philosophy. And I went to a lecture in 2016 in Tokyo on Mencius's philosophy, and the lecturer was a Chinese, I could say a monk, but it's not quite a monk, but well, he was a Taoist teacher.
Hmm.
And he invited me to his temple in Taiwan. 6 months later, I went there and I was initiated into a Taoist temple. And being a Mason for, at that time, 35 years, I immediately recognized the first degree initiation as being exactly the same as the Taoist initiation. I was
Int-
bowled over.
Interesting. So, what made you how did you become a Mason though? Was it something
Yeah.
that your family had been involved in?
Yes, rather like your family, my family, my father, my grandfather were Masons. My grandfather was in the Grand Lodge of England as an officer,
Hmm.
and so it's something they took a lot of pride in. And so, um, of course, I have two grandfathers. They were both Masons, and I was with my maternal grandfather when he was sick, and he was staying at my house because he wasn't feeling well. And one evening, the Speaker of the House of Commons came to our front door, and I opened the door. I've seen this person on television, but I couldn't remember his name, and I was, why are you here? Well, he came to see my grandfather, and it turned out they were in the same lodge.
Hmm.
And that's one of the things about lodges, is that we look after each other. And
Hmm.
even though he's a person of, similar to, Nancy Pelosi, he came all the way to my grandfather to visit my grandfather to
Hmm.
make sure he was okay. And that to me was really significant,
Hmm.
And so I studied a bit and eventually I joined.
Interesting. So, do you have to be invited to? Can you just walk up and, yeah, I'd like to.
Sorry, a little. We're 20,000 miles away, and a bit of that disappeared.
So,
Sorry.
do you have to be invited into the lodge, or can you just
No.
ask to join?
You have to ask. We don't invite people, and that's one of our cardinal rules: is we don't proselytize. People have to come of their own will and volition.
Hmm.
And so that is one of the difficult parts of Freemasonry. Um, we would like to choose people, but it's no, we so what we do is we put on, let's see, show our best face. We do a lot of charitable works, and people recognize these charitable works, particularly in Japan. We support children's uh, forgotten the word, Minashigo is uh, it's it's forgotten the word for it. It's where children are kept when they don't have parents.
Daycare.
Sorry, no, not daycare. It's an institution. They live there.
Oh, okay. Orphanage.
Yes, orphanage. Thank you. I've forgotten the word. Yes, so we support orphanages in Japan, and we put on events for them, and we do a lot of things. We give out food and clothing for the homeless and things like this. So we hope that people see these and start to ask questions, and then are attracted to what we do.
Perfect. So, are there people who are not allowed to join the Masons?
Um, No, we don't discriminate by race, gender, or creed. When I say gender, we are divided by males and females, so that we don't meet in the same organization.
I
We
see.
have Masonic organizations for women, and we have Masonic organizations for men. And I believe actually this is based again on Taoist principles. It's the same in Taoist temples. Originally, it was a man-only organization in China because it was for the elites, the people. It was a kind of religio-philosophy
Hmm.
for the court, the emperors and people like this. And it started something like 200 BC. So it's a very old organization, 2,500 years old Taoism. It's way older than Christianity.
Right.
Um, so from that time, it's always been male. But in the last something like 50, 60 years, they allow women into the temples, but they have to sit on the left side and the men sit on the right side.
Interesting. So, I learned a little bit about Freemasonry from a book written by Dorothy Leon. And Dorothy Leon is from the United States. She used to live in Oregon, and she discovered transcendental meditation.
Yep.
And she was practicing transcendental meditation, and she'd also been studying theosophy. And she was doing a transcendental meditation in her dining room in Oregon. And in the meditation, she thought she had seen a flash of light, and she opened her eyes, and there was a dark haired man sitting there in her living room. And he looked at her and he said, "Do you know who I am?" And she's like, I think I do. I think you're Comte Saint Germain. And he was like, "That's exactly who I am." And he asked her to write a book.
Hmm.
And he said, "I would like you to write this book." He told her what she should eat. And in the book that he worked with her on, he talked about the Freemasons. And he said the Freemasons are freedom builders. Um, and the reason they exist is it was to change the world government. They brought the promise of democracy into the world. And from what he explained in the book that they came from craftsmen and guilds, and this was an effort to bring about a different type of world and a different governing. Um, and I was interested in is that in your book coincided a little bit with what was in that book, because it looks like 1717 was
Hmm.
when there was a revival in um, the Masonic Lodge. And do you kind of concur with that? That that's what was going on at that time in 1770? There was just
Well,
a shift.
I think you got 2 points here. Firstly, you mentioned stone workers, and secondly, democracy. About the stone workers, originally masons were stone workers, and this goes back to medieval times. And the workers in England formed guilds so they could protect their wages and also the quality of their work. So if you have a guild, you'd have to have an apprenticeship, which was by law 7 years. And normally these apprentices were taken advantage of. They weren't paid at all, but they were taught skills. And after 7 years, they would have to be a journeyman for a couple of years, which meant that they went out into the market or traveled the country looking for work, practicing their skills. And then after a total of about 10 years, they come back and they would make what is known as a masterpiece. A masterpiece is an example of how good their skills were. So if the journeyman was a cabinet maker, he would have to come back and make a beautiful cabinet. This masterpiece would be kept at the guild as an example of this person's level of education. So it's the same for the stonemason, except for some reason they didn't form a guild, they formed a fraternity. And I think the reason for this is because they had to travel all the time. If you were a cabinet maker, you would have a workshop, and that's where you would be, and then you would sell on your goods. But for people who are building cathedrals, abbeys, castles, large mansions, they'd have to travel to the worksite. So they became fraternities. And they also had exams, and to show that they were members of the fraternity, they learnt these secret words. And for example, we still see this in the city of London. We have something called Cockney. A lot of Americans think that all British people speak like a Cockney. Unfortunately, that is based on the 2 or 3 markets we used to have. Covent Garden, which used to sell fruit and vegetables and flowers, and then Smithfield, which would sell meat, and Billingsgate would sell fish. And these workers, to protect their job from outsiders, invented this language called Cockney. And that's exactly the same was happening in the guild system. But in 1717, 3 gentlemen, and it's extremely important to mention that they were gentlemen. They were actually part of the gentry, which set them 2 ranks above workmen. They weren't workers. They weren't blue collar workers. They weren't stonemasons. One of them was the secretary to Sir Isaac Newton at the Royal Society. Another one of them was the director of the Exchequer, whereas you would call the Department of Treasury, we call it the Exchequer. And a third one was purported to be a lawyer, but we don't know so much about the third person. These 3 people were educated, university educated people, and they were not blue collar workers. So it sets them apart. And in England, our class system, even now, is really quite strict on this demarcation. And so these 3 people decided to set up a Grand Lodge. And so they weren't helping stonemasons reorganize their structure or writing bylaws for them. They decided to use the stonemasons' imagery of making something, making a house where you could meet God. That's one of the elements that we have in Freemasonry. And this, as it says in the Bible, we should create somewhere in our heart to meet God. So we use the same symbolism, but what they did is they fused it with this Chinese Taoist idea, I believe, because it was so popular at the time. One of the things about the gentry is that many of them were not salaried workers. They didn't receive money. Very few people received a weekly or monthly wage in those days. They would have a sponsor. normally an aristocrat. He would come around with a bag of money or some coins and say, "Thank you for your work."
Mhm.
The amount to be paid would be pre-decided, and so the payment would be paid or the work wouldn't get done. So the gentry really relied upon the aristocracy for their future. And so I believe that by creating this really interesting Taoist Masonic organization, this would attract the aristocracy. The aristocracy at the time were all interested in Chinese things. They were collecting china, they were collecting silk, they were wearing silk. Their houses and gardens were being made in Chinese designs. There was a movement to look at whether Taoism or Confucianism could be combined with Christianity, because they felt that the Chinese system of philosophy was the ideal meritocracy. And they were looking for this fusion. People like Gottfried Leibniz, in England, Thomas Hyde, who is a professor at Oxford University. These people seriously thought that Chinese philosophy could be somehow combined with Christianity. And so all these people, and this Chinese boom, and it wasn't like we have booms nowadays, a short-term boom. It's like 6 months and it's gone. We're talking about 50, 60 years of nothing but Chinese. The next one to come was 100 years later, and that was Egypt. Egyptomania is called, because Napoleon had taken an army into a campaign into Egypt, and he had sort of he called it discovered the Sphinx and the Rosetta Stone, and then Champignon. He translated the Rosetta Stone, I think it was 1822. Suddenly people could read what was written on the walls in his beautiful temples. Suddenly there was this big Egyptomania. But that was 100 years after. So boom in those days there was so little information. Books, there were few books, there was little entertainment, there weren't very many shows like at the theatre. Shakespeare was popular, but they'd have one play playing for a whole year.
Right.
You wouldn't want to see it 3 times. So anyway, so I believe that these 3 gentry decided to invent this organization to give them the opportunity to meet aristocracy, because the aristocracy were interested, and is exactly what happened. Aristocracy became the Grand Master of Freemasonry. They weren't gentry, they were dukes and earls. And then after about 20 years, the Prince of Wales, who is the son of the king, became the Grand Master. And after that, we had something like 15 kings as Grand Masters. This is because of the interest. The first Grand Master was George, Prince of Wales. His father was George III. He had a disease called porphyria. It was a neurological disease that made him seem as though he was mad. He wasn't actually mad, but unfortunately, that's how people portray him. Even nowadays, people don't understand mental disease so well. He had porphyria, and the government said he was unfit to rule as king. So then the Prince of Wales became Prince Regent. And when he was Prince Regent, he did a lot of things to support China. He sent envoys to China to open up trade. He built a fabulous pavilion by the sea called the Brighton Pavilion. It's actually should be called, I think, the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. But anyway, and it's full of Chinese things that he had collected.
Mhm.
So I think this idea of the aristocracy having this kind of private excitement about China, which was to them, nobody had ever been to China. So, it's the only people who've been to China were Jesuit priests.
Mhm.
And Jesuit priests, they were scholars. That's the whole thing about the Jesuits. They base their mission on teaching and studying. And so when they went to China, they actually studied Chinese language. So they're able to translate um, Confucius and Mencius Lao Tzu into Latin, which
Mhm.
was the franca, lingua franca in Europe. All the educated people spoke Latin.
Mhm.
So if you were French, German, or English, didn't make any difference. They all communicated in Latin. And so that's how the three people were able to um, get patronage from the aristocracy for their new venture, this idea of transmitting light and enlightenment. And of course, it was the era of enlightenment. So
Mhm.
what would be better than have an organization that initiates with light? It's perfect.
So, you mentioned the Jesuits, and I know it was interesting in your book. It became uh, the Catholic Church did not approve of the Masons, and at one point forbid Catholics from
Mm,
joining
that's
the
true.
Masons. And
Yes.
it has is that still the case today,
Yes.
or has that changed?
Yes, so this is another very strange situation. To me, it's a kind of duplicity of religion that people try to enforce laws and then they're very lax about, they turn a blind eye. If you look at the papal bull, the first papal bull was published or issued in 1738, I think 34. No, 38. And the reason for this was you have to look at the history of the time. If you just pick out this thing about Catholicism, people get the wrong idea. But England at the time was a Protestant country surrounded by Catholic countries. You had Catholic Ireland, Catholic Scotland, Catholic France, and Catholic Spain. And if they organized themselves, we could have been wiped off the map. But and the second thing is interesting, that even though we were a Catholic country, our kings, King James I, Charles I, Charles II, James II, they were all Catholics. Catholic kings running a Protestant country. I mean, it's just, but somehow it worked, And but the problem was there were people in Scotland, particularly in Scotland, who wanted to restore. So at the end of James II, he abdicated. He just ran away, and we had what's known as the Glorious Revolution, when William III came into England and established a Protestant king with a Protestant country. And so James II escaped to France because he was Catholic, so they accepted him as a brother or a cousin. And this upset the followers of James, and James in Latin is called Jacob. So these followers were called Jacobites or Jacobites. And they caused a lot of trouble. There were several uprisings in England. The last one, it was actually mentioned in the Constitutions of the Freemasons in 1723, the first edition, when they talked about in 1716 the uprising by the Jacobites. The Jacobites wanted to, of course, put a Scots, or at least a follower of James and Charles, a Catholic, on the throne. And so this is a very difficult situation. And we kept on having uprisings until about 1749. So that's 30 years after Freemasonry was established. Freemasonry became very popular in England and grew very fast. And one of the issues that England had is because of the Catholics. So there was a law that discriminated against Catholics, particularly Scottish and Irish. And so they had their freedoms were limited by law. So they were not able to join Freemasonry. So they started their own Freemasonry organization, and it was called the Grand Lodge of the Ancients. They thought that their Freemasonry was much older than the Freemason, the new Freemasonry that started in 1717. So they started their own organization. So then we had a Hanoverian. Of course, the king at that time was George I. He had come from Germany. It's interesting that England had a German king, but this is a theme that comes even today. People will talk about the German connection in the royal family, and it's interesting to look on the internet. The uncle of Prince Charles, Lord Mountbatten, his real name originally was Battenberg, which is a German name, and because that was sensitive in the Second World War, he changed his name to Mountbatten. We have a lot of issues about that. Anyway, so since 1700s, the royal family have all been connected to Germany, and so we had the Hanoverian Lodge, which is now which was what we call the Premier Grand Lodge, and then we had the Scottish and Irish, and they were always at each other's throats. They weren't actually fighting, but they denigrating each other in the press and things like this. And so the second lodge, which started later, the Grand Lodge of the Ancients, supported the Jacobites, and this lodge started to grow a lot in France and in Germany, and I don't think so much in Spain. But the Pope was worried that there were two Grand Lodges in France competing against each other, a Protestant one supporting the Hanoverians, and then the Catholic one supporting the Jacobites. And of course, the Pope didn't mind the Catholic ones, but he didn't want the Protestant ones to proliferate. So what he did is says, just get rid of them all. I just don't need it. And he put out this papal bull in 1738 saying Catholics cannot be members of a lodge. This still exists today. It has been watered down a little bit. The Catholic bull, I don't think they call it a bull, but the Catholic ordinance is that a Catholic should talk to his parish priest before joining Freemasonry. And of course, the priest will try and tell him not to. But the strange thing is that in Catholic countries such as the Philippines or Brazil, we have hundreds of lodges and thousands of members who are all Catholics and Masons. And the Holy See turns a blind eye to it.
I see.
I see. Yes.
Now, what's interesting about I was curious about those factions. Does the Temple of the Ancient, the Scottish version, still exist? Did they merge into the Premier Lodge of England?
Yes. So what happened is that various countries, Freemasonry just spread across the world, and they decided to have Grand Lodges for their own countries. And so Grand Lodge of Ireland, Scotland, and England all have their own Grand Lodges today. We do not have a Grand Lodge of the United Kingdom. And in America, so during the American War of Independence, a lot of what we call traveling lodges, so these are lodges that don't have to have a fixed location. They could be on a campsite or in a military barracks. These lodges these lodges, traveling lodges, were created after the War of Independence. Many of them found homes in places like Charleston and particularly in Virginia, Massachusetts, Boston, these areas. Lots of old Masonic lodges are there. And so they then set up Grand Lodges for each state. Again, there is no Grand Lodge of America. There's only state-wide lodges.
Interesting. So now, are the three degrees the same throughout all of them?
Yes. So some of the wording is different because of the influence of the Grand Lodge of the Ancients. In 1813, the two Grand Lodges, the Hanoverian and Jacobite, they joined together, and they spent about 3 years trying to work out whose ritual should be the ritual and which password should be the password. And eventually they sorted it out, and it became the United Grand Lodge of England, which is what we call it now. That's why it's the only Grand Lodge in the world called the United Grand Lodge.
So, let me ask this question about in regards to the degrees. So, if there are 3 degrees,
Yes.
what does it mean when you're a 33rd degree?
Right. So, besides Blue Lodge Freemasonry, we call it Blue Lodge because everything, most of the decorations are blue, our aprons are blue and things like that. And of course, the apron is just a symbol that we came from a background of people who built buildings and cut stones and things like this. So beside that, we have what we call appendant bodies. And these are other organizations that started again in the 1700s, some 1730s, 1750s. They weren't very organized, but they started teaching other things because there was such a boom in these what you call philanthropic, philanthropic. Well, I get there. I think you know what I mean. These organizations, just because people looking for entertainment and to meet and to learn and to study things, and it was the Enlightenment. So all across Europe and France, people were setting up other organizations, and they had different themes. And so one of them was set up in France, and it said that it was teaching an ancient Scottish teaching called the Scottish Rite. And the Scottish Rite started from where Freemasonry stopped. So Freemasonry has 3 degrees. Scottish Rite starts at the 4th degree and goes up to 33. The reason for 33 is many ideas, but one of them is that Jesus Christ died when he was 33. That is one of the suggestions. So when you go to join Scottish Rite, you have to take all these degrees. To become a 33rd degree Freemason takes, I don't know, it depends on the organization, but I would say 20-25 years is quite quick. Yes.
I do know. So I had heard that term used as well with my great uncles and my grandfather. They had also been 33-degree Masons. So one thing that you talked about in your book as well was that there's a misconception that the Knights Templar started Freemasonry, and you basically point out the dates that isn't true.
Right.
The Masons did not come from the Knights Templar; they were completely separate.
Correct. For several reasons. Firstly, these 3 gentlemen, when they started Masonry in 1717, so that would be John de Sagulier, George Payne, and Anthony Sayer, they started from zero. They rewrote the rituals. They took the rituals from the ancient guild, and at that time it was basically 1 or 2 degrees was just an initiation for people who wanted to be apprentices to join into the guild of stone cutters. And so they not only rewrote these, and I believe they rewrote it to hide these Chinese teachings, but not using Chinese words. They had to, so it took them nearly 8 years to complete the task. And they also added a 3rd degree. The reason being is that alchemy is a 3-step process. And what the whole teaching of Freemasonry is a kind of alchemical process to change a person spiritually. So the reason there isn't a Knight Templar connection is, firstly, the Knights Templar were disbanded in 1314, 1315, and from that time to 1717 is not only 400 years, but it's something like 16 generations, giving a generation being 25 years at that time. It was 16 generations. I'm getting a warning that my battery's not looking good. 16 generations. It's a very long time to keep a secret from
Hmm.
when they were dissolved. My English is falling apart. I got to practice. I got to take English lessons. Um, so, and until 1717. Secondly, they were a military knighthood, so you would expect to have some of that chivalry in modern Freemasonry, the kind of chivalry, the honor that they had, a chivalric order with all the rules, etc. And
Hmm.
that doesn't appear in Freemasonry. And the third point is, of course, they were also priests. They were warrior priests, and they received their charter from the Vatican directly. There is no overt Christianity in Freemasonry at all. So those three things deny a Templar connection, I believe.
Exactly.
Yes.
So the secrecy about the Masons,
Yes.
does that mostly have to do with at the time, these organizations being parts of um, um, working class folks? Um, is that what the secrecy was about?
I
Um,
have something terrible to say. My battery is, look on my computer, is about to die and I need to get a connection. Is it possible to kind of ad lib for about 30 seconds?
yes.
Sorry to say that. I'm badly prepared. Apologize.
Well, while he's getting that, I just want to remind everybody that if you do visit our station website, www.wltk.com, make sure you click on the shop link and check out the WLTK DB store. And you can find lots of merchandise there with the WLTK DB logo. You can find hats, hoodies, mouse pads, even spandex that are fashionable with the WLTK DB logo. And all of the merchandise on the WLTK DB station goes to support the station. So it allows us to bring on new programming. It gives us the opportunity to update our equipment, and it really helps us out. So while you're looking for your favorite shows on the WLTK DB site, don't forget to click on the WLTK DB store and take a look. You might find something there that would really, really strike your fancy. And I think we might be connected, Christopher, or we might have just frozen. There we are. Welcome back, Christopher. I think we can hear you, or maybe not. I don't think we can hear you now. Hmm. This is the thing about technology. It doesn't always agree to be a good dance partner. Well, as it doesn't look like we can hear you, but we can see you. We can see you, but we can't hear you. While we're figuring this out, you if you didn't know, Dr. Christopher Earnshaw has a YouTube channel, and you can find it by searching his name on in the YouTube search. You can just go to YouTube in the search, just type Christopher Earnshaw, and you will find his YouTube channel. And on the YouTube channel, he has videos that explain Freemasonry, um, as well as everything that is in his book that we discussed tonight about initiation by light. And it looks like we lost him completely, but that's okay because we're nearing the end of the show anyway. I just want to thank Dr. Earnshaw for being a part of our show, and he'll probably hear this later when we go to podcast.
Can
But
you hear me now?
I hear you now.
Sorry about that.
We're getting ready to close the show,
Yeah.
Dr. Earnshaw. But I want
So
to.
your question about secrecy. Um, one of the things about secrecy is that in the early days, right from the beginning, Freemasonry was a charity, and so we collected money from the members, and we gave it to distressed members who had, I don't know, fallen into poverty, um, or to help the widows of members. And we didn't want people who were not members to get this money. So
Mm.
we had to make the organization secret with secret passwords so that people who are not members just couldn't apply.
Eh,
So
Oh,
that's one of the reasons.
well, thank you so much. Hey, we were just pointing people to your YouTube site where they can take a look at your videos that you've created there, which are great. And also, I have a link on our website, our newbridgeradio.com website for your Amazon link to the other books that you've written that are very good. And I just want to say, Dr. Earnshaw, it has been lovely having you on the show,
Thank you.
explaining masonry to us. A lot of people out there have questions about it, and you
Well,
have.
I mean, if I could just finally just kind of sum it up, I think Freemasonry is a force for good. It promotes social cohesion because it doesn't discriminate by politics or religion, or we don't compete against each other. So we like to support the society that we're members of, and so I think I'm really proud to call myself a Freemason, and I try and promote it as much as I can.
Well, thank you for doing so on this episode of the New Bridge Radio Show. Can we have you back? And next time we'll have to let you talk about cooking because I graduated from I graduated
Right.
from Le Cordon Bleu too. So,
Oh, excellent. Yeah.
well,
Yes. When I was single for a long time and I got fed up of eating beans on toast and hot dogs, so I wanted to cook something that was nutritious, and also would perhaps find me a nice wife. All wives want husbands that can cook, I think. And
well,
I'm about to write a cookery book as well. It's one of my next ventures.
oh, nice. I will definitely keep an eye out for that. Well,
Thank
I,
you.
I can't thank you enough. That is going to do it for us on the New Bridge Radio Show. You'll have to join us next week when we will be talking to transformational coach Rachel West. For now, stay tuned for Haunted Voices with Todd Bates.